Oh, I tend to wander around. So.
Okay.
Yeah, so ready.
Can we check if people online? Yeah, they can hear. Cool. They can hear. Cool. They can hear. I checked it. Oh, it's fine. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the seminar today by Professor Richard Hall. Richard has got a long CV, which will take for me days to read, but I'll just highlight few of his key contributions. Professor Hall is the chair of biomechanical and oncological engineering in the School of Engineering at the University of Birmingham, which I had a good opportunity to visit early this year, where he's setting up not one, but not two, but three different laboratories from scratch. And he's a physicist by training, and he has baptized himself to become an engineer. That's what he calls. And he was a professor at the Leeds University previously, and the whole research group has moved to Birmingham recently. So he leads several flagship EPSRC projects, some of which are the OncoEng, Biotribe, etc. But what really stands out is, he's been a nominated technical committee member on ISO standards, on several ISO standards. The numbers are here. It's quite large. I'm not sure if it's true, so I'll let him decide the numbers. It's quite, but mostly on implants for surgery. So he has been on several ISO standards and implants to surgery. But what really resonates with the work that Richard does is he's always keen for contributing to the society and making change in bringing this complex orthopedic engineering to make it accessible to common public. As part of this, we will be running a social medical design workshop tomorrow and day after. Many of you have been part of it in the previous edition, and there's one that's happening tomorrow and day after. But the intention is to bring out orthopedic engineering for access to mass population. And Richard was kind enough to sponsor a student from UCT to spend a month in Leeds and Birmingham, who was the winner of the social medical design last year. And he's also looking forward to select the new candidate who can spend a month in Birmingham next year. So with that introduction, I'll hand it over to Professor Hall.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you, Sudesh, for the warm welcome and the kind introduction. Sometimes I wonder whether it's the same person when people speak in such glowing terms, as it were. Of course, it's not just my work that contributes to that set of outcomes, but also the work of my colleagues, my PhD students, and my postdocs, who over the years have made a huge contribution to the group and wider society. So what I'm going to talk today is largely around failure in implants, particularly around total joint replacement. We often hear about how successful joint replacement is. It's considered probably the most successful of all orthopedic interventions, and probably second only to the cataract operation. And it's still evolving. We have new materials, new medical devices, and with those come new challenges. So one of the key roles in any introduction or regulation for a medical device are the standards by which you have to test those devices, both preclinically, but also when the device is being manufactured through quality assurance, and also which tests you actually do and how do you operationalize those standards, and what additional work do you have to do in terms of joint assessment to make sure that in the first place your device is safe, and in the second it's going to be efficacious. So as Sudesh said, I'm a physicist by training. I masquerade as an engineer. I needed a job. I finished my physics PhD. I needed a job. My partner was moving to Durham. I had to follow her to Durham, and I was offered two positions as a postdoc. One was in physics, essentially doing what I've been doing in physics before, which was looking at noise in complex systems, or I could go into bioengineering. So we had a big discussion, and Chris said, the final kind of, the summary essentially was, if you fail at physics, you're going to become a physics teacher. So I'm up on that statement, the rest is history, as it were. So I wanted to smash atoms, I wanted to be a big scientist. No, Brian Cox took my job. So now I'm smashing bones instead. So the video's not working, let's see if we can get this, oh yes, there we go. So we smash bones. So we smash bones in terms of spinal impacts, we smash bones in terms of limbs and other bones as well. So that's essentially what we do. It's all easy stuff. There's no rocket science here. There's no big whizzing around electrons or whatever, hadrons. It's easy stuff. So I'm going to go through some work around standards. Standards is a hugely important component of any medical device introduction, and its ongoing surveillance within the market. I'll talk briefly about joint replacement and what joint replacement is. Standards and standardization, which most people see as the most dullest exercise going. And I must admit that when you go to these implant meetings and you talk about the latest standard, you talk about the latest developments, you talk about the latest test methodologies, and once you begin writing the standard, once you've formulated what test you need to introduce as part of that standardization process, often it comes down to considering whether we should put words like shall we or could we or must we and things like that, because they have legal definitions in those contexts, and you have to be very careful of the language that you use. And lastly, we will talk about failure in joint replacement. So we spend thousands, millions of pounds every year testing these joints. We have standards that cover these devices in terms of what tests you have to do, but we still get failures. And what I will try and do is explore in the first place why we still get failures and what are the possible solutions to those failures going forward. Apparently, Sudesh says you're here till about 2 o'clock. Is that right, Sudesh? No, it's only an hour. So background, I come from Birmingham. It's a city in the middle of England. Who's heard of Birmingham before? So most people. We have a Premiership football team. That always raises the profile of a city. So we have Aston Villa. I'm not an Aston Villa supporter, by the way. I live in Newcastle, so I'm a Newcastle United supporter. Best football team ever, you know. It's about a population of about 1.2 million, so a quarter of the size of London, but it has 5 universities, of which the University of Birmingham is the dominant one. That's the research, what we call research intensive university. So this is Birmingham on a rare sunny day. It has 8,000 staff, the usual complement of students, PhD students. At some point, 11 Nobel Prize winners have been linked to the university. Don't ask me how or why. It's just on the website, and we are a relatively good QS and Times Red rankings. So in terms of my research and the research in mine and Mike's group, we have key capabilities around simulation. So this is for joint simulation, so testing, both in a standard way, but also in a beyond standard way, medical implants, largely around joint replacement, but also around spinal implant and other technologies as well. We have, and what we're supposed to be looking for in the end is this idea of smarter kind of treatments. So there's a big push at the moment, as there is in the UK, as there is globally, around early diagnostics, although sometimes I think that the term early diagnostics is overplayed. And what we need to do is that if we have this kind of improvement in our diagnosis, particularly early stages, then we need smarter and kinder treatments. The existing treatment protocols we have just won't cut it. They won't cut it in terms of the economics, and they won't cut it in terms of patient responses to them. So we look at a lot around kind of prophylactic technologies, and an emerging, and part of that is through the emerging domain of regulatory science, which is quite big in the US, but the rest of the globe has been relatively slow in looking at research to actually as a positive tool for improvements in regulation. one might expect, we have global collaboration. So these are our funded collaborations over the past 10 years. We collaborate mainly with academic institutions and healthcare institutions, but also a number of global players in the industrial landscape as well. So medical devices. These are a set of medical devices. These are medical devices from Roman times, so over 2,000 years old. They don't look that much different than some of the medical devices you still see around, lying around in your doctor's office. And what we often say is that the technology around medical devices has changed a lot, particularly that surrounding the medical device itself, the particular device that interacts with the human tissue. But we still have knives, we still have catheters, also, so on and so forth. And my neurosurgeon says we need to change the way we interact with tissue, and that's beginning to be seen today as we go forward. So total hip replacements, most of you will have parents, grandparents, uncles, aunties who at some point have had a total hip replacement, and often they have a relatively good response. The older you get, the more positive the response is generally, because the focus there is pain, and you've had a long-term osteoarthritic condition or a similar condition. If you're young and you've had a joint replacement due to trauma, let's say a road traffic accident, then you often find the response to that particular implant is less favourable, because an expectation that the joint replacement will give you back the biomechanics you had previously, and certainly it doesn't. So they've been around since, in a kind of industrial sense, in a large-scale sense, since the time of John Charnley. So John Charnley worked in just north of Manchester in the 50s and 60s, and he was the first person really to develop joint replacement on in a systematic way. We see at the bottom left-hand corner as you view, that's Sir John Charnley on a Wednesday evening apparently, and he used to manufacture the cups for these prostheses, for these implants, the night before surgery in his garage or his workhouse, in his workshop at home. He would then sterilize them using some form of liquid, and then he'd implant them into the patient. Now, his first set of joint replacements were unsuccessful. He used PTFE. Most people have come across PTFE as stuff you stick in frying pans, non-stick. And John Charnley's idea was that because they were low friction, he needed to put that material into the joint, because he felt that friction was the issue with previous attempts at joint replacement. And what he found was that actually they wore at an exceedingly high rate, and after 4 years, the head of the prosthesis had worn right through the socket, and they had to be revised. So in '62, just by sheer chance, his technician had an interaction with a person from the cotton industry who said, use polyethylene. We use that in the cotton industry, works well, it's relatively low friction, but it's exceedingly low wear. He switched to that particular type of plastic, and essentially that plastic is still in use today. Clearly there's been modifications, such as through the addition of vitamin E, or through the more modern cross-linked polyethylene, which has essentially now, shall we say, solved the problem of wear to a large degree, and now we have joint replacements out to 15 years, which show no wear-related adverse effects at all. He was also responsible for cement technology, for fixing the joint, but also for this idea of a clean air facility to reduce the amount of infection or the infection rate one saw through these surgeries. So there's been a number of innovations. The first innovations were around infection and dislocation, because they were seen relatively early in the product life cycle. In the 80s and 90s, it was stem fracture and the wear of materials. The wear of materials became such a big issue. It has evolved from the 2000s and 10,000s. And as I said before, the wear of materials, the wear of these materials as part of the device itself, has largely been solved through the introduction of cross-linked polyethylene around about the year 2000. There have been disasters. When I was a postdoc, we looked quite a lot at a device called the PCA, which was at a failure rate of about 25% at 7 or 8 years. And more recently, in the 2000s, there's been the issue around metal and metal devices, and also the adjunct technology of what they called resurfacing arthroplasty. In the metal and metal and resurfacing arthroplasty, it cost DePuy in the end, in terms of compensation and also the reoperation of a huge number of patients, somewhere in the region of $4 billion. So that medical issue, that medical challenge that was hoisted on the community because of, as we'll see later, inappropriate testing, actually cost that company, as I say, in excess of $4 million. So food for thought on that. So what are the next big issues? There's a lot of evidence now that it's going to be bone fracture around prostheses at the plus 10-year period. We are now recording an uptick in what we call periprosthetic fracture. We stick these devices in patients when they're 60 and 70. They're now surviving to their 80s and 90s. The bone quality reduces substantially through primary osteoporosis, but in some cases secondary osteoporosis due to things like HIV or type 2 diabetes. And we see the fractures. And the issue with this is they block beds and are very expensive to treat. A primary hip replacement, the first one, will cost in the UK about 10 grand, about £10,000. For a revision procedure around a periprosthetic fracture, it's £30,000 plus. So, you know, hugely expensive just in terms of operating and procedural time. The other issue is they tend to block beds. In a primary hip replacement in the UK now, you're in and out of hospital in one night. You have the procedure, an overnight stay, you're out, exercising, walking, maybe on crutches the following day. If you've had a periprosthetic fracture because of the risks associated with that and because of possible comorbidities, patients are often kept in hospital for up to 2 weeks. And that has serious implications for any healthcare system in which you have a finite resource. So we're looking at issues around poor bone quality. The other problem is we have the McDonald's effect. There's quite a lot of evidence these days that the initial peak bone mass in people of 30 and seen in 20s, 30s and 40s is no longer being observed in that population, largely around issues around poor diet. So if you don't start off with good bone mass, you're still going to lose your bone, through osteoporosis, through aging, through menopause, if you're a female. And that means the chances of osteoporotic fracture or periprosthetic fracture are going to increase. So we still kind of have technologies that we like to put into people. We have ceramic coatings. So these are things like titanium nitride. They are largely used in cases where people have allergies to certain metallic kind of elements to try and reduce any metal sensitivity. There are a number of coatings on the market, as I said, titanium nitride, zirconium dioxide is another one, and there are things like diamond-like coating, which are a bit more experimental. And one can use a range of different coating technologies to deliver these. The issue is they work great in the lab. You can test them in the lab under standards, various standard testing regimes, your 14242, let's say. The coating stays on. Perfect. Stick it in the body, coating comes off. You pull these joints out after the coatings come off. Actually, they function reasonably well because the coating has hardly any effect on the overall performance of the joint. But they do come off. They do come off because the standards essentially aren't up to it. And we'll explore that in a bit more. Another big push at the moment is additive manufacturing, particularly around custom implants. They are great for putting in surfaces on cementless implants for fixation, where you can have an integrated porous coating. They allow a customization of shape, although I must confess that when I see some of these shapes, it's probably just as easy to do it with traditional subtracted manufacturing. But the real power of additive manufacturing is not customized shapes, it's customized structural properties. You can actually make the joint or the stem or the implant to have particular properties that behave in unusual manners just by designing different cellular structures. And one of the projects we're looking at in oncological engineering is to do this through minimally invasive, or to do this for a minimally invasive implant, which you can inject to support the vertebra that's suffering from a lytic lesion. So you get a better match of properties to the physical environment in which the implant has been put in. The issue there is it takes a lot of technology. It takes a lot of computational power to customize these effectively. And that's really at its infancy. And what you're also finding at the moment, like all new technologies, there's a big rush. There's a big rush with AI. Everybody's jumping on, machine learning, all that sort of technology. In a few years' time, you'll have a dip where people find out it's not as good as people said it was. It's been overhyped. And that's what you see in additive manufacturing. At the moment, there's a pushback, particularly from the clinical community, from the surgeons. They have to wait too long for the customized devices. There are issues around getting debris that's held within the implant out, which the regulators are now seeing as a target for quality assurance. So there's a huge raft of issues here that the community, the industrial community and the academic community in particular, will have to solve before the resurgence again of additive manufacturing. But it's not going to go away. The potential for additive manufacturing is too great. And now there's tissue engineered solutions. When I moved from physics engineering to medical engineering in the 90s, the mid-90s, mid and early 90s, I went for dinner with someone from Dupuy International. They were one of the senior managers there. And we talked about tissue engineering. Then people were saying in 5 years' time, we're going to all have these wonderful solutions for tissue engineering. We're going to have cartilage plugs we can put into people. Joint replacement's not going to happen anymore. 30 years later, we're still waiting for those 5 years to happen. And in fact, joint replacement has an economic advantage. It's a mature technology, but it also can be produced relatively easily. Now, a stem, which is a piece of cobalt chrome or a piece of titanium, or in some cases a piece of stainless steel, you can manufacture for several hundreds of pounds. It's cheap technology. The surgeons know how to put them in. We know from some of our data that these will survive in patients for 25, 30 years now. And they'll survive in patients in a relatively good way as well. They'll have no adverse effects, they'll be relatively pain-free, and they'll be relatively mobile. The challenge for the tissue engineering community is how do I match those prices? How do I match those economics? And up to now, that doesn't seem to be the case. Clearly, you see highlighted cases in the press, one or two people getting a trachea implant or things like that. But in terms of sustainable, in terms of scaled up technology, there's nothing to match joint replacement yet. So standards, regulation, and medical implant testing. All our devices need an overseer. We can't leave it to companies to manage their own oversight, as it were. So we have a system of laws, standards, and oversight mechanisms that are designed to ensure the safety, effectiveness, and the quality of our medical devices. And we have various classes, various rules. Some of those rules straddle countries, such as the regulations within the EU. Some of them are within separate countries, such as the FDA in the States. But they are, the FDA is by far the most dominant medical device regulator globally because of the size of the market for the US. The US market for medical devices is roughly 50% of the global market. In South Africa, you have your own South African health products regulatory authority, and there's this new idea of this pan-Southern Africa activity called Zanzibona, which is an initiative that Sudesh himself is involved in. So, who's used the standard before? Who's done a test which has involved the replication of a standard in a laboratory? Well, some people are slightly nervous about raising their hand at the back. So what did you use your standards for? What sort of tests did you do? Or right. Okay, so that was just testing the bearings or something within the wheel. You know, see how long it could last for. How long did you have to run the tests for? Just as a matter of interest. A long time. And was it so? Was it a quite onerous test? And did you have to do some assessment afterwards? Look at the bearings and things like that. Yeah, and they take a long time. You know, it took a long time to set up. I bet you have to do it, and you did it on more than one device. How many devices did you do it on? 6, 10, 12? Okay. Okay. And did you publish the data, or was this for a particular company? Or okay. Okay. Thank you. So there are various standards, as you know, there are standards for wheelchairs, the ones that we're involved in are for knee, hip replacement, interbody fusion devices, or things like that. Now these go into patients. Hopefully they will last for the patient's lifetime or what the rest of the life they have. So if they're in their 60s now the expectation is perhaps 25 years, although most patients, if they have them at the age of 60, will be warned that the chances are they will have to have a revision. I think the success rate now, according to the registries, is about 50% of successful implants at 25 years. So, you know, relatively good, but no, there's a room for improvement given that the population demographic is different from what it was in the 1960s. Just before we go on, why do people think we have standards? What are standards used for? What are standards used for? Go on. Yeah, so prevention of misuse. So what do you mean by control? That's an interesting, rather emotive word. So it's about consumer protection. Oh, so protection of the patient in this case. So anybody else got any ideas why we use standards? Yeah. So relative. So if you say that you're going to use a standard in your marketing papers or whatever, in your marketing in general, then by law you have to have tested it with that particular standard or that set of standards. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Well, in fact, standards. There is a consumer protection element for standards, but why industry loves standards is because if they do a test in one country using the standard, they can often use that data or use that information in another regulatory regime, saying that we've done that test to that standard, and hence we don't have to do that test again. So it's about improvements in trade. So when the medical device regulation was first proposed in Europe, industry were absolutely adamant that this idea of facilitation of free trade would be the principal use of standards within the EU. There is a health protection, a consumer protection element, but they are largely focused around facilitation of trade to ensure that if you introduce a device in one country, it's easier for you to introduce a device in another country and therefore reduce overall costs. Clearly, you know, countries can put in their own regulations, but they would often find very quickly that companies wouldn't invest in that particular regulatory environment. So there is a trade-off there. So standards, improvements in trade, they can provide a framework for economies, efficiency, interoperability. So when we originally had CDs and things like DVDs, they only really took off once the companies got together and decided that they would share common technologies and therefore have common standards for the use of these technologies. So it's usually important not only in closing markets, but actually opening up markets and provided a basis for innovation. If you try to innovate and you know what your targets are, you know in general what the framework is for a device in that particular market, it's far easier to innovate than if you're innovating blind, as it were, if you don't understand what the regulatory authority wants in terms of its safety and its efficacy. So obviously, as I've said, and as you noted, we are trying to enhance consumer protection and confidence, and it all may support public policy objectives. So an obvious one in that is regulation around net zero and climate change. So a standard is useful for business and supporting public policy, blah, blah, blah. It's got to be obviously technically accurate, and we do that largely through consensus. So when we get together, we agree on the mechanisms for a particular standard, the test protocol, or we may suggest particular features of a particular device that must be incorporated. So it's got to be desirable and practical. So there's no use having a standard which only one person in the world can run. So it's got to be available to a wider population or a wider set of institutions or organizations as possible. It's not got to be exclusive to one particular party, because that would give an unfair competitive advantage. As I say, it's got to serve the needs of the wider community, and it's got to be consistent with regulations and legal principles. So it's not got to conflict with any existing laws or laws that may be brought in the near future. And it's a document. That's all it is. It's a document. It's established, as I say, by consensus, by agreement. It's approved by a recognized body. So I do a lot of work, as Sudesh said, in ISO, the International Standards Organization, but also the British Standards Institute, and CEN, which is the European equivalent. So they provide rules, guidelines, or characteristics for activities or their results aimed at achieving optimal degree of order in a given context. So there's got to be some improvement in whatever you're trying to do, whether it's enhancing free trade, so on and so forth. And they're generally, but not exclusively, focused on the use of science and technology in a wide number of contexts. So standards have the following characteristics. I'm not going to go through that. They are voluntary. There is no requirement in general for the use of standards in a legal framework. So if a standard's developed, you don't have to follow it, but you will be asked to justify why you haven't followed it. So the regulatory body may say, well, that's fair enough. Either we suggest you go away and do test it with that standard, or you give a reason why you're not, and you provide us with an alternative set of data through a different assessment. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, they do become compulsory if it's contained within a trade description of a product. So your marketing product says, this standard was used in the testing of this device to try and give it a market edge against your competitors, or if it becomes a contractual agreement. So if someone comes to me and says, I need this device testing with ISO 14242-1, and then as part of that contract, I must test those devices with that particular standard. Or in certain circumstances, it may be made mandatory by law, although in the health sector, that's not particularly common. So we test joint replacements. You come to our laboratory, we have big machines ranging anywhere from £250,000 to £1.5 million, £2 million, depending on the sophistication, the size, and the level of control that these machines exhibit. They can weigh anything from a few pounds to several tons, which has caused Birmingham a bit of an issue when trying to put these heavy machines in the first floor of a building. And now they're going to be put through the roof. They're going to take off the roof and lower them in with a huge crane, but I won't be there to see it. So we try and test for new bearings, so new articulations. This may be a new coating or a new surface treatment, new materials, cross-linked polyethylene. We had a big European project I led in the 2010s looking at silicon nitride, or new designs. One of the big issues at the moment is around non-articulating surfaces. Can someone give me an example of what a non-articulating surface is in a joint replacement? Well, what's an articulating surface? Yeah, so it's the head against the socket, yeah. So what's a non-articulating? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Not really. Not really. They tend to be either an articulating device or a single piece device. Well, that could be considered to be a non-articulated, non-articulating interface, and that can certainly shed debris. Yeah, you get fretting type motion there, the release of particles, and in certain circumstances you get an adverse reaction. But principally, when people say non-articulating interfaces, they mean modular interfaces. These days, you get a head and you get a stem. Yeah, and you put the head on the stem, and lo and behold, this thing will fret. It will fret and corrode, and it will do so at an accelerated rate. And those particulates, particularly metal particulates or metal ions that are released, have been demonstrated to cause adverse reactions within local tissues, which can ultimately the prosthesis will have to be revised. So we have sets of standards, we have these machines, we have also now protocols for looking at the wear debris, looking at how the cells respond to this wear debris or the ions within fluids. And these have all been developed through principally ISO, but also the US equivalent bodies such as the ASTM, and also through some work we did at CEN. So these are the machines. So here's two machines from our laboratories. The top one is running a standard ISO cycle. Now, standard cycle comes from data that was largely released in the 1960s by a guy called John Paul, who worked at Strathclyde University. And you can see in the diagram to the left of the top simulator, that is the axial load that's being applied to the particular joint. So you get two peaks, which are synonymous with heel strike and toe off. You get a flat period or a low load period during the swing phase. Could someone suggest what the problem is with that? So these will run for, let's say, typically 5 million cycles. Does anybody actually, for 5 million cycles, just walk? Well, that's the benchmark. That is the absolute benchmark for a total hip replacement. Yeah. The diagram below and the figure to the left is actually for a jogging cycle that you can run on our machines. And they generate a different set of data than you would do through the standard ISO cycle. So running higher loads, higher rates of change of motion, and higher kinematics. So we have greater extensions of the hip against the acetabulum, as it were. And you get obviously higher wear in those scenarios. In fact, you get 2 to 3 times the wear that you would do in a standard gait cycle. The issue here is most of the simulators in the world, and there's probably not that many, can only run the standard gait cycle. It's only because we're an academic department and we want to go beyond the standard that we can run these adverse scenarios. So we're one of the probably 2 or 3 labs in the world that can run these types of tests. And we also do corrosion. Again, there's been an uptick in the identification of failures, both in articulating implants, but also in non-articulating scenarios. And this here is for spinal implants, where metal debris and ions are released due to the fretting corrosion seen in these types of devices. And we can measure the amount of ion release. The great thing about corrosion, as opposed to wear, which was the which you would identify in the simulator test in the previous slide, is you can do this over a relatively short period of time. A few days will give you enough data to differentiate between different biomechanical or different environmental scenarios. In a simulator, a 5 million cycle test over 6 stations, so 6 joints, will take you about 4 months. And you'll get essentially 1 data point from that 4 months, which is the wear of those devices over that period of time. So, medical device success and failure. How do you think we measure the success of hip replacements? What's the most common measure of measuring failure in, let's say, a total hip or a total knee replacement? Yeah, so how do you measure the longevity? What is it that gives you that measure? How do you work out whether a joint's become loose or not? What's an easy way of doing it? Yeah, it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort. Yeah, these are all nice patient-related things, but people want something easy. These are going to take time. You're going to have to employ people. It's whether it stays in or not. Revision procedure is the most common way of measuring the success or not of a total hip or a total knee replacement. Yeah, so all your international joint registries, which now have logged in them millions of total joints, yeah, their primary outcome measure is whether it's not being revised or not. You can argue whether that's a good measure. Certainly, you brought up some issues there. You know, people may not be allowed for whatever reason to have a revision procedure, even though they need one. They may be frail. They may have comorbidities that prevents them having an anaesthetic. They may not want another procedure because it's been such a disaster the first time round. Yeah. We reckon from our discussions with the people at the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital, about 20% of knee replacements, we call them suboptimal. That is to say, their challenges aren't severe enough to have a revision procedure, but they certainly impact on the patient's quality of life. And again, there's a big push in the UK through the NHS to try and improve initially the quality of the procedure and therefore the quality of the outcomes. So joint replacement registries are great. They're easy, but they don't tell you the whole story. In fact, they mask some of the issues or some of the challenges that our clinicians, our physios, our rehab people see on a daily basis. So this is typical. So this is some data from the largest joint replacement registry in the world, that of the UK. It goes out to now 16 years. So this is the latest data. According to this, at 17 years, the failure rate is about 8%. It's pretty good. Pretty good. You know, if someone offered me that as my odds, I'd probably take it. They may say, oh, well, you know, so you do all this research. But what I've just said is some of those replacements, some of those procedures won't live up to the reputation, even though, you know, they're classed as being successful as this. So just be slightly careful. So revisions or the revision procedure isn't the panacea that people suggest, you know. There have been moves to try and do other things, like intention to revise. That's another one, or using more patient-focused outcome measures. So the primary cause, up to very recently, in joint replacement has been attributed to wear, and the response of the tissues surrounding the joint to wear particles and or corrosion products. For polyethylene particles, you tend to get osteolysis. For metal debris or metal ions, it was a mixture of metallosis and this idea of pseudotumors. So the graph to the right shows the failure rates in metal resurfacing procedures, and there you were talking about 12% at 7 years, where in the traditional joint registries data for other types of prostheses, you were talking about 3% at 7 years. So clearly a huge difference. It became a big media frenzy. People were talking about joint replacement, the challenges of joint replacement, the mechanics, the science around joint replacement. And what we found, so by some of the work that was done at Leeds, was the reason why joint replacement for resurfacing metal and metal or traditional metal and metal prostheses was of the surgical intervention and the malpositioning of the prostheses. In the laboratory, people were testing it as though it was in its perfect location. The axes of the femoral head, the center of the femoral head, coincided with the center of the socket. And under these ideal conditions, you've got low wear, so on and so forth. However, even though surgeons are great, they're well trained, trying to get your femoral head precisely in the position you want with regards to the socket is quite a demanding aspect, particularly when you have little knowledge about the patient's own musculature, the way they walk, their aspects of activity. So in those cases, you get this malpositioning, and that hugely increases the rate at which metal debris is released. And that huge increase in metal debris is the cause of this, this enhanced failure. And you can get it in not only at the articulating surface, but now at the modular surface. So this is where the head links to the rest of the prosthesis, the stem of the prosthesis. So the neck-head interface is often known. And this headline was from 3 weeks ago. This is 3 weeks ago in the British press, talking about my NHS hip replacement poisoned me. Because essentially, she had accelerated wear within this non-articulating interface, and it worn so much and released so much debris and ions that it had caused an adverse tissue reaction, pain, and she had to have it subsequently revised. And there's some, I think, 20,000 of these prostheses currently in patients in the UK. So a big problem. So why are implants failing? I do lots of testing. Companies do lots of testing. So why do you think implants are failing? Yeah, that's one thing. Tests aren't suitable. Anything else? Yeah, patient needs are certainly changing. We're putting them in younger because they've been so successful. They go in younger patients, they go in more active patients. Originally, they were putting patients with osteoarthritis. Now you put them in different pathologies. So people with rheumatoid arthritis, trauma patients. Yeah. Any other? Yeah. So there's an issue around capability. Can we actually, simulate accurately that environment? Yeah. Sorry. Sorry, overloading. I suppose there is a sense in overloading that we don't have the machine, or a lot of companies don't have the machines that can demonstrate heavier patients or patients which would have higher demand activities, such as playing sports and things like that. Yeah, so there is that sort of thing as well. There's a myriad of activities, actually. And here's a list of them. So all current standards are retrospective. So really, to get an idea of what tests you have to do, to some extent, you have to see the failures. So you've got to match the tests to the failures. So there's always going to be a lag. And typically a standard would take 4 to 6 years from its conception to its release. So 6 years is a long time. So that's one reason. Testing regimes are often based on a limited average biomechanics, so the way people walk. We don't test our aircraft by testing the stresses when they fly through the sky. That's a relatively low environment, a relatively low stress environment. They get tested by seeing what happens when they take off and land. We should be doing the same with joint replacements, actually. There's limited capacity. The number of simulators in the world probably numbers 100, 150 around there. Most of those can only do the basic standard testing. Only a few of them can do the adverse testing. So there's limited capacity, limited capability. I told you the test takes 4 months, 4.5 months to run. So you're looking at probably 2, maybe 3 tests a year if you squeeze it in. And it's expensive. Doing one test, one simulator run, including staff time, will cost you about £100,000 in a UK university, including staff time, support, technician time, and the facilities or the consumables to go with it, the flash lubricants and everything. So it's an expensive business. And that doesn't include the depreciation of the kit. These kits tend to last no more than 10 years. So if it's £1 million, the depreciation is, clearly it's not linear, but it's on average £100,000 a year before you have to go out and buy a new one. So machines are expensive. Standard machine costs you 0.3 million, adverse high loads, £1 million upwards, limited in number, and most simulators are limited in loads and motions. So what are the solutions? Can anybody propose solutions? How do we get around this? Have you got the cash? Yeah, okay, yeah, that'd be good. The only slight issue there, you're probably going across different countries. Different countries have different requirements. You know, Sudesh will tell you the bones in South Africa are different from the bones in Europe, or different from the activities in Japan, let's say. Okay, so there's an issue there. Anything else? So you can tinker, can't you? You can perhaps accelerate the tests. What's that going to do? You're probably going to improve the throughput 20%, 30%, something like that. It's not going to be hugely different in the greater scheme of things. Okay. Well, we can tinker, yeah? We can do all these subjects like shorten the test time, increase capacity, higher spec simulators, artificial lubricants. It's not going to do that much. The most radical changes one can make are looking at risk-based strategies for testing rather than having standard test regimes themselves, but in silico modeling. The idea of in silico trials would be a huge game changer in how we test our devices. So what's the challenge there? If we move from a physical simulation to in silico simulation. Yeah. So validation strategy is one. We've got lots of patients, we've got lots of failures, we've got lots of implants with successful outcomes. So if there's a political will, we've certainly got the data to do that. What are the other challenges? Just getting the data to put into these models is a huge thing. Now, when you talk about an articulation, you're talking about a complex interaction with two surfaces. because we're talking about not just the interaction of a surface, fluid surface, but we've got all sorts of protein complexes to go with the surrogate synovial fluid, which is bovine serum in this case. All those components have to be included in your model. It's no good just using your data and then recycling that data. You've got to work these models from first principles to get effective results. So there are challenges, but people are working on those challenges. My colleagues at Imperial, who we work quite closely with now, can model the bearing interface using these complex scenarios in which you include proteins, in which you include different lubrication regimes to try and look at the wear process. The great thing about in silico modeling is it's quick. You can do it in parallel. You can do it over multi-dimensions. So you can look at variations in how the patient will use this joint. You can look at variations in the bone remodeling qualities of your patient. How does the bone respond to the implant under various scenarios? You can look at the difference between a female patient or a male patient, a high demand young patient or a low demand high patient. And you could do this quickly because you can do it all in parallel. You don't have to wait for one test to run before you can start another test. So there's a huge push at the moment to look at in silico modeling. It's not there yet. It is a multi-scale approach. It's a multi-dimensional and a multi-scale approach. If you get it right, the possibilities are phenomenal in terms of testing your modern joint replacement. The key components are things like finite element analysis, which you've all come across, or some other of the methodologies, musculoskeletal modeling. The issue here is, up to now, when you look at the journal papers, most musculoskeletal modeling probably has 20 or 30 patients. We were commended for having 160 patients in one study. We possibly are talking now, for this to be successful, for silico modeling to be successful, you need the data for thousands of patients. You need to understand how these patients move under different scenarios at different times of lives for different occupations, for different lifestyles. You need to understand more intimately the contact mechanics, not only between the articulating surfaces, but for the non-articulating surfaces as well. But it does allow you to perhaps be more patient-specific. It does allow you to look at how the joint replacement would fare if you change a particular technology or particular surgical technique. So it's a far more powerful technique than you will get from just pure simulator testing. It will give you not only the data you get from simulator testing, but it will give you additional data as well. And this is some of the stuff one can do. For wear testing, there have been models around since the time of Tom Brown that we worked with in the 90s. They were relatively simple, and despite being relatively successful, they didn't give us the opportunity to explore the contact mechanics in great detail. So they're never really taken up. As been noted, one of the great issues is validation. We have to validate these models. The key question is, once a model's been validated, how far can you stretch that model into different scenarios for that validation to remain in place? How does that validation tail off as you move from your scenario? And in fact, we would suggest a more risk-based approach to this. So what we'd like to see is your model identifying scenarios in the patient profile or the patient demographic you've got and say, you're going to see an adverse effect here where this high demand patient does this particular sporting activity, or where this patient who's got arthritis, if they're under this particular loading scenario with this biomechanical environment. And then what you would do as the experimentalist is go and check those out on your machine. So it becomes a more mature relationship between the experimentalist and the computational scientist or the theorist. Something as one sees in the high energy physics or the astronomy or the cosmology communities at present. At the moment, I would contend that we haven't reached that in bioengineering. Bioengineering still sees a person with a finite element model copying the experiment from a paper and then saying their model is validated and then using it for something completely different. That is not, to my mind, validation, and that's doing the community a disservice. The other challenge, of course, is regulatory acceptance. When is the regulatory community, which is the guardian for the patient, allow us to use this data in earnest? There have been recent movements lately. The FDA no longer requires animal experiments for certain pharmacological interventions because they reckon the computational and the in vitro modeling is of such sophistication now that animal experiments in certain circumstances aren't required. So things are moving forward. And you can look at personalized treatment. You can also begin to think about surgical guidance. Preoperative planning, post-operative management. What will a patient have to do in terms of rehab following a particular procedure? We work a lot with surgeons who do massive implants for tumor resection. One of their big demands at the moment is, how do I relocate some of the muscles I've had to take away from the bone because that bone's being resected, and where do I place that reattachment? And one of the things we're working at the moment is using computational models to demonstrate effective ways of that surgical kind of intervention. So there are advantages. It's ethical. It reduces animal experimentation. It would reduce, hopefully, patient experimentation as well. Initial clinical trials. It would be cost effective. It would be rapid. It would allow a more effective intervention or effective iteration of certain design changes or certain material changes, and it would allow for personalized simulations rather than generic ones. Limitations, as I said, the input data quality is an issue at the moment. The assumptions of the models would have to be noted and would have to be mitigated in any form in any experiment, and as we said, robust validation, and I would contend that validation would be context specific. Future trends, obviously the buzzword AI. So in summary, in silico trials, they represent a pivotal shift in how joint replacement could be designed and tested. It will reduce reliance on physical trials, including animal studies, and it would allow us to remove from prescribing a single environment for testing to a more realistic, real-world environment in which we get to test our joints in environments of as actually the patient would use them, rather than in some generic average across the board. Right, just one last thing. Hold on a minute. Cricketer, which technology? Okay, so I've told you all about this technology. There's one person I haven't talked about at the moment. Do you know who the cricketer is? Jimmy Anderson, the greatest living bowler. I would say that because he's a Lancashire man and I come from Lancashire also. He should be called Sir. He should be called Sir Jimmy, actually, but that's for another story. So, when you go into a joint replacement, so Viv Richards, used to play lots of cricket. Used to play 3 times a week, but was a bowler. Yeah, used to bowl. When I was a kid, Viv Richards. Who's heard of Vivian Richards? So Viv Richards, absolutely fantastic batter. Took England apart in, I think it was 1976. Took them apart, The bowlers came, the 4 fast bowlers, absolutely destroyed England. But he had a bat. The bat was called the Jumbo. And I was a crap batter. Couldn't bat to save my life. Number 11. But it said on this advert, if you wanted to bat like Viv Richards, you had to get the bat that Viv Richards has. Right? So I thought, brilliant. Pressured my mum and dad, buy me this bat. Buy me this bat. So I bought this bat. What do you think happened? Pardon? I went from, I think, number 11 to number 10. And that was on a good day. Nothing, of course. Nothing happened. I was still a rubbish batsman. I still didn't get a 6 in competitive cricket. And I never got to 50. Yeah? But there is an important tale here, because we could talk about technology all we want to. Yeah? But when you're in the operating theatre, it's the surgeon that's in command. Yeah? It's the surgeon experience and skill that matters so much more in those few hours or those few minutes than whatever technology you use. So this is data showing the differences in technology to the left. To the right is some data around the revision rates as a function of surgeon operative rate. So this is the number of procedures a surgeon do a year for total joint replacement. The band is fairly broad. So as you get out to 240 procedures a year, so 5 a week, let's say, 6 a week, we can see that the central line there, the probability of failure, I think it's within the first 5 years, was down at about 1%. Clearly there was some give or take. But the key thing is here, surgeon experience counts for so much. Once they get below 50, 60 a year, the failure rate of those surgeons increases quite markedly. And that's just not, that's been now demonstrated in a number of studies or a number of data sets, that for, regardless of technology, the surgeon counts for so much. So one of the jobs as bioengineers is not only to devise new technologies, to devise new designs, devise new materials, but is to help to ensure our surgeons have the right tools and the right education, the right training, and the right opportunities to be successful surgeons. And that's why we work closely with surgeons, and we take on board some of the challenges they have around interventions of where muscles are going to go, so on and so forth, to help them perform better operations. So our job isn't just about new technologies. Perhaps the most important bit of our job as medical engineers is trying to ensure surgeons have the right tools to do the job properly. And I will leave you with that. Just want to thank, obviously, my sponsors, my funders, who give me lots of cash every time I write 6 pages of text, particularly the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, who fund most of the technology research for healthcare in the UK. The MRC, which most of you will have heard of, the Medical Research Council, tend not to fund their technology. They will fund the application of that technology, but it tends to be the Engineering and Physical Research Council. And they spend roughly a quarter of their portfolio on healthcare. A lot on AI, a lot on net zero, but also a lot on healthcare as well. And there's various other initiatives we have around Birmingham for trying to translate that technology. And I've got one last question before you start asking me questions. Now, who's an engineer here by background? This is a device I saw being marketed in probably about 2005. So this was for a total disc replacement. It's all shiny. So this surface here is the articulated surface. Yeah. Would you have that device put in your spine? Given that you would have any total disc replacement put in your spine. I wouldn't, but there we go. Given this, why would you be concerned by this design? No, come on, this is hardcore engineering. This is hardcore engineering. Think a bit of tribology. Probably okay. It's probably okay. When cars skid, right? If you're on the motorway, you have a load of water on the motorway, you apply your brakes, you skid, yeah? How do you prevent skidding? If you have tires, what prevents skidding? Yeah, you're having good tread, yeah? So if you've got an articulating surface, which you don't want any contact, the last thing you want on your surface is this nice spiral here. What you want is to, as far as possible, generate that fluid pressure that keeps those two surfaces apart. And you won't do that by having a spiral put on it. I don't know who designed this, but when I told the person on the marketing team that this was, goes against all biotribological principles, her response was, "It looks pretty." But it was taken off the market a few years later, like most total disc replacements were. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. That was fantastic. I'm not sure how much time we have for questions.
Have a rabbit done a bit too long?
We're already over. Oh, so yeah. So Richard said it's going to be until 2 o'clock, right? So yeah. Now, probably we'll get like 2 questions and wrap up the session. Any pressing questions?
Well, I've answered a lot of questions already.
Richard, maybe I'll start with the question and others can follow. So we, the standards are great and definitely we need to comply with them. There's no question about it. But coming from a South African environment, like where we are trying to get even the production manufacturing standards aligned, the testing standards are almost non-existent throughout the continent, right? So we had a first-hand experience when we tried to create our own shoulder implants, and a simple ASTM F2028 test. It took us 5 years to make the test rig, to many hundreds of thousands of rands to build those equipment, and on top of it, we weren't able to even hit 1 million cycle with those test rigs. So how do you say, and this is something that we did discuss briefly yesterday, what would be the bare minimum kind of standards that one could actually follow? Because ideally we would want to follow all the standards, but what would be your threshold to get started?
I think you've got to look carefully at what the clinical demand is, yeah, and focus on those areas where the clinical demand is high. Certainly, running standards, building the test rigs, maintaining the test rigs, ensuring the test rigs are complying with with whatever standard requirements are, is a long process. It takes years to build up that capacity in terms of technicians, sort of thing. So I think you've got to focus on those areas in which you need those standards, as it were. So you've almost got to prioritize. So we prioritize. We can't run all the standards in our facility, so we prioritize. And even the big test houses that just run the standards tests, as opposed to doing anything adverse, have a limited capacity. Yeah, they will do a certain number of them because you just can't, there's too many. Or they focus on a particular domain like orthopedics or stents and, cardiovascular devices and things like that. So I think you've got to be quite clear where your market is. I think you've also got to be clear about what industry wants testing. Yeah, so speak to your local indigenous manufacturers, see what they want in terms of testing, see whether you can come to some arrangement over providing resource for that testing. things like that, and make sure that, I think also you need to make sure that you're linked to the community. So you're linked to people who've got standards experience or have got preclinical experience. And one thing that I'm kind of quite enthusiastic about is that we've been talking to people from Brazil who've gone through this process recently of developing their own preclinical testing facilities as part of a federal program. I think, you know, engaging with that particular group of people, I think for South Africa would be a good start, as it were.
Fantastic. Thank you, Richard. Any more questions? Just wanted to highlight, Richard was so impressed with the last seminar that he gave virtually. He said the question sessions were longer than the actual seminars. I think we are breaking the jinx today with no questions. Okay.
Yeah, the opening gambit was someone said, I've got 4 questions.
All right. Yeah, Khadija. Yeah.
Thank you for the great presentation. So just with regard to the in silico modeling, right? So how do you, or what challenges do you foresee if somebody would want to maybe incorporate tissue engineering into the in silico model? Yeah.
Well, that's a huge challenge because you've got to put into that model all the biological processes as well as all the mechanical stuff that has to go with it. So, you know, it's an order of magnitude greater problem to solve than it is for, you know, the traditional joint replacement, in which, you know, there are now models available to look at things like bone remodeling or bone modeling. Yeah. But for tissue engineering, particularly those outside the musculoskeletal field, you know, it's a huge challenge. But people are, you know, doing it now. People are looking at tissue engineered interventions and modeling them successfully in a, you know, in a computational environment. Whether they're at the stage yet where you could use it for regulatory purposes or preclinical purposes, I couldn't comment on that. But yeah, but certainly there are models out there that are, you know, approaching that sort of level of sophistication.
There's one question on the chat, so maybe this can be the last.
Sure.
Okay. So Shazad asks, with AI and in silico modeling and smart implants, how would you predict the future of joint replacement in the next 3 to 5 or long term?
I think in 3 to 5 years we'll still where we are today, actually. I think, you know, you've got to understand that things don't change very quickly and for good reason. You know, people have got to be sure about what their changes will do to the population that they're going to be implanted in. So in the 3 to 5 years, you may get a bit of tinkering, as I put it, you know, a slight modification there or whatever. But I think in the 15 to 20 year or the 15 to 30 year, then you are going to see significant changes. You're seeing those in, let's say, again, I'll go back to tumor or tumor resection, where you've got massive prostheses, where you get custom build prostheses. They are now developing them in which they design the prosthesis computationally. So you get the X-ray or the CT scan, you put it into Materialize, that then gets, you know, tested in various scenarios. You choose the design that you think is most appropriate, you make your STL file, and lo and behold, you get your additive manufacturing. The problem is there, it's slightly too slow at the moment. No, surgeons want these implants in a month. If it's 3 months down the line or 4 months, the environment's changed. They're going to have to do a different procedure on this per patient, perhaps. Yeah. So they want it quicker. They want it quicker, and they want it safer, and they want it kinder for the patient. Now, this idea of, you know, patient being satisfied with their procedures has to be key. You know, patients are going to reject procedures that aren't kind to them. You know, patients are fed up of having radiotherapy that puts them in bed, or massive surgical interventions that puts them in bed, particularly if they've got a limited lifespan. Yeah, they want to be treated prophylactically. They want to be treated before the bone fractures and things like that. So I think there will be a push, and I think you will see more customized designs. Yeah, but I think you will also see a lag in the regulation, like you always have done. No, the regulatory science will want to see the evidence, or the regulatory authorities will want to see the evidence. I think one of the key things is that there is now a body of researchers who are working in the regulatory science environment. So they're looking more closely at how their modeling or how their testing fits with the requirements of regulation. So you may get some acceleration there, but you're not going to get a huge amount of acceleration. There's still going to be a process, and there's going to be trials and things like that. People aren't that confident yet they're going to do away with, RCTs or trials in general. They'll become a kind of adjunct. So people say, well, we'll do this trial, but as part of that, in parallel, we'll do the in silico trial, see what it can predict that we can't get from the RCT or whatever.
With that enthusiasm about using AI, so we'll conclude the seminar now. So let's thank Professor Richard Hall for thank you, everyone. So Professor Hall will be in UCT until the 13th of November. There are a series of workshops and seminars that are going to be conducted. So if you're interested in interacting further, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.